Welcome to Softly Curious. Tonight, we begin not with places, but with the idea of place itself. A map is often mistaken for a picture of the world, something that shows what is already there. But maps were never designed to be mirrors. From the beginning, they were tools of choice, decisions made visible. Long before accuracy mattered, meaning did. The earliest maps were not drawn to show distance. They were drawn to explain position, where water could be found, where danger began, where the familiar ended and uncertainty took over. In many cases, they were created by people who had never traveled far at all. Their knowledge came from listening, not seeing. This is one of the most important facts about maps. They are social objects before they are scientific ones. A map gathers fragments, stories from travelers, directions remembered by sailors, coastlines repeated from earlier drawings. What appears precise is often inherited. What appears solid may be copied. In ancient cultures, maps were not separated from belief. Rivers could be symbolic as much as physical. Mountains could represent barriers of meaning, not just elevation. Orientation itself was unstable. East was often placed at the top, not because it was north, but because it was sacred. The rising sun defined importance before it defined direction. This means that early maps were not wrong in the way we think of error today. They were accurate to a different goal. One of the quiet truths of cartography is that every map answers a question, but the question is rarely, what does the world look like? More often, the question is, where am I safe? How do I return? What lies beyond what I know? Because of this, empty space on a map is never neutral. Blank areas are not simply unknown. They are deliberately unfilled. They mark the edge of usable knowledge and quietly signal where confidence should stop. In early maps, these spaces functioned as protection, preventing the reader from assuming certainty where none existed. This is why many of the earliest known maps are small in scope. They focus tightly on routes that were traveled repeatedly, on rivers that were depended upon, on coastlines that were observed directly. The rest of the world is not denied in these maps. It is postponed, waiting until experience or testimony can support its inclusion. Another often overlooked fact is that maps did not originally belong to travelers themselves. They belonged to rulers, merchants, and institutions, those who needed to manage land, collect resources, and exert control. Boundaries mattered long before borders were formalized. Ownership preceded precision, and administration came before exploration. As a result, many early maps exaggerate what mattered most to power. Cities appear larger than geography would suggest. Trade routes are emphasized, and regions of little economic or political interest shrink or disappear entirely. What could not be controlled often became visually distant, even if it was physically close. This introduces one of the defining properties of maps. Importance distorts scale. Even today, maps stretch and compress reality to fit their purpose. Transit maps simplify geography to clarify movement. Political maps highlight borders over terrain, and digital maps emphasize businesses over ecosystems. These are not errors. They are functions. A map that tried to show everything would show nothing clearly. Clarity requires exclusion, and usefulness depends on limitation. Another fact rarely stated plainly is that maps are designed to be used, not admired. Their beauty is a side effect, not a goal. When decoration appears through symbols, illustrations, or color, it serves memory and warning more than aesthetics. In early maritime maps, coastlines were drawn with intense precision, while inland regions remained vague. This was not ignorance, but relevance. Sailors needed accurate coastlines to survive. Inland accuracy had little immediate value to those navigating by sea. Accuracy, in this sense, is contextual. The same region could appear radically different across maps made at the same time, each reflecting the needs of its intended user. A religious map might center the world on a holy city. A trade map might ignore it entirely. And a military map might reduce the same landscape to obstacles and passages. All are maps, and none are complete. One of the most persistent myths about cartography is that maps steadily improve over time, that early maps were crude and modern ones perfected. In reality, improvement depends on the metric being used. Modern maps are extraordinarily precise in distance and position, but they are often less transparent about intention. Earlier maps openly signaled uncertainty. They showed monsters, warnings, and blankness. Modern maps hide uncertainty behind smooth interfaces. What is missing is rarely labeled as unknown. It simply does not appear. This creates a subtle psychological shift. Older maps invited caution, while newer maps invite confidence. And confidence changes behavior. Maps do not merely represent space. They produce behavior. Roads are taken because they are shown. Areas are avoided because they appear empty or dangerous. And borders feel real because they are drawn. Once a map is trusted, it becomes authoritative. And once it becomes authoritative, it reshapes reality to match itself. Settlements grow where maps highlight access, and trade routes solidify where lines are drawn. Over time, the map and the territory begin to resemble each other, not because the map was correct, but because it was followed. This is why maps are rarely neutral. Even when they appear purely descriptive, they carry consequences. Early cartographers understood this intuitively. They knew that a line could become law, a name could become permanent, and a blank space could become feared. Because of this, early maps often included commentary notes, symbols, and visual cues that spoke not only of land, but of limits. The absence of detail was sometimes more honest than false precision. One of the most fascinating aspects of early mapping is how little individual authorship mattered. Maps were collaborative long before collaboration was named. One map borrowed from another, inheriting both errors and insights. This is why some inaccuracies persisted for centuries. A coastline drawn incorrectly once could be copied dozens of times before being challenged. Correction in cartography is slow, not because information is scarce, but because trust is fragile. A known error can feel safer than an unfamiliar correction. Maps, then, are conservative objects. They resist change even as they record it. This resistance explains why imaginary features survived for so long islands that never existed. Land bridges inferred but never seen. Entire continents proposed to balance the globe visually rather than empirically. These were not always fantasies. They were hypotheses made visible, educated guesses rendered permanent through repetition. In this way, maps functioned as thought experiments. They allowed people to think about the world as a whole, long before it could be seen as one. To draw the world is to imagine it. Maps also compress time as well as space. They present the world as static, even though landscapes shift constantly. Rivers move, coastlines erode, forests advance and retreat. Maps freeze these processes into a moment, creating the illusion of stability, as if the world were finished. Early mapmakers were often aware of this limitation. Some included multiple outlines, alternative coastlines, or notes indicating seasonal change. Modern maps rarely do. Simplicity has replaced nuance, making maps easier to use, but also easier to believe without question. Belief is where maps gain their quiet authority. By the time a map reaches its user, countless decisions have already been made: what to include, what to omit, what to emphasize, and what to normalize. These decisions are rarely visible, yet they shape every interaction that follows. Learning to read a map, then, is not just learning direction. It is learning interpretation. To ask why something is here, why something is missing, and who needed this map, and for what often matters more than coordinates. As we move forward, from early attempts to draw the world toward individual mapmakers and strange lands, this understanding becomes essential. Without it, old maps look like errors. With it, they become records of how knowledge once moved slowly, unevenly, and always through human hands, not because they were wrong, but because they were human. Another essential fact about maps is that they always exist between certainty and uncertainty. They are never created at the moment of full knowledge, but at the moment when enough is known to act. This makes every map provisional by nature, even when it appears final. Early map makers understood this intuitively. They did not wait for completion, because completion was impossible. Instead, they worked with thresholds. Enough information to sail safely, enough detail to tax land, enough orientation to return home. The map was not a finished object, but a working one. This is why early maps often look uneven. Some regions are dense with detail, while others dissolve into suggestion. These differences are not mistakes. They are records of attention. Where people traveled, traded, or fought, information accumulated. Where they did not, space remained abstract. Maps therefore reveal movement more than geography. They show where people went, not simply what existed. This becomes clear when we look at how coastlines were drawn compared to interiors. Shores were traced again and again by ships moving slowly, carefully, repeatedly. Inland regions were crossed less often and described secondhand. As a result, coastlines solidified early, while interiors lagged behind, sometimes for centuries. In this sense, maps preserve the rhythm of exploration. They thicken where repetition occurs and thin where experience is rare. The world is not evenly known, and maps make this unevenness visible. Another subtle truth is that maps require trust long before they earn it. A sailor following a map had to believe that the lines corresponded to something real, even if no one could verify it fully. This belief was not blind, it was pragmatic. The cost of disbelief was often greater than the risk of error. Once trust formed, maps gained momentum. Each successful journey reinforced confidence. Each safe return validated the drawing. Over time, trust hardened into authority. Authority changes how maps are read. Early users approached maps cautiously, supplementing them with local knowledge, observation, and improvisation. Later, users relied on them more directly. The map shifted from guide to instruction. This shift is crucial. When a map becomes instructional, deviation feels like error rather than adaptation. The map begins to dictate behavior instead of supporting it. This is where maps quietly cross from description into prescription. Another fact often overlooked is that maps simplify not just space, but choice. By showing certain routes and not others, maps quietly narrow the range of perceived possibilities. Paths that are drawn begin to feel legitimate, while paths that are absent feel risky, unfinished, or forbidden. This says very little about the terrain itself, and almost everything about representation. Over time, this narrowing effect shapes habits. Travelers return to the same routes because those routes feel established. Settlements form where lines already exist. What begins as depiction slowly becomes infrastructure. Maps do not force this process, but they enable it, and enabling is often enough. Maps have always carried power, which is why they were often closely guarded. Detailed maps were restricted to elites because knowledge of routes, resources, and borders meant control over movement and advantage. This control extended into language itself. Naming a place on a map fixed it in memory, turning fluid landscapes into stable, claimable locations. To name was to make permanent. Early maps often reflected overlapping perspectives. Multiple names for the same place could coexist, preserving local and foreign understandings side by side. As maps became standardized, this plurality faded. One name replaced many, consolidating authority over both space and meaning. Clarity increased, but alternatives were quietly erased. Orientation and scale further shaped perception. There was no universal up in early maps. Direction reflected worldview rather than physics. Later, north became dominant, and this choice began to feel natural despite being arbitrary. Scale followed attention rather than accuracy, exaggerating what mattered locally and diminishing what felt distant. Maps taught hierarchy through layout long before users noticed. Over time, maps came to feel neutral, even as they remained selective. They aged more slowly than landscapes, retaining authority after reality had changed. Early users treated maps cautiously, aware of their limits, while modern users often forget this distinction. Maps have always been arguments about what matters and what connects, and understanding this allows us to read old maps not as errors, but as records of priority ways of thinking that continue to leave traces. Early maps rarely belong to a single mind. What appears as authorship is usually the final act of a long chain of listening, copying, correcting, and trusting. Mapmakers did not stand alone before the world. They stood at the end of accumulated movement. Their work reflects not discovery, but assembling knowledge gathered indirectly, shaped by repetition rather than direct observation. One of the most persistent misunderstandings about early cartography is the idea of the lone genius, a mapmaker who personally traveled the coasts, measured distances, and returned to draw the world exactly as it was seen. In reality, most early cartographers never visited the majority of the places they depicted. Their knowledge arrived through testimony accounts shared in ports, markets, and along trade routes. This indirectness was not a weakness of early maps. It was the system that made them possible. Ports, markets, and ships functioned as moving archives. Sailors described coastlines from memory. Merchants carried route knowledge alongside goods, and pilgrims returned with fragments of distance and direction. Each account was incomplete on its own, but repetition created patterns. Where stories overlapped, confidence grew. Maps emerged not from certainty, but from convergence. This is why early maps often feel uneven in their clarity. Some coastlines appear sharply defined, while others dissolve into suggestion. The difference reflects not skill, but exposure. Repeated travel produced precision, while rare movement produced abstraction. In this context, the role of the mapmaker was closer to that of an editor than an explorer, someone who selected between competing accounts, weighed familiarity against novelty, and decided when repetition was sufficient to become form. Authority came not from seeing, but from choosing. A clear example of this process can be seen in the work of Piri Reis. His world map was not drawn from a single source or journey. It was explicitly described as a compilation, assembled from older maps, some already lost by his time, and combined with contemporary accounts from sailors and navigators. What matters here is not the accuracy of every detail, but the method. Piri Reis did not claim originality in the modern sense. He claimed access. His authority lay in gathering and preserving fragments that might otherwise disappear. This approach was common across cultures. Mapmakers relied on inherited material, carrying forward Greek and Roman geographic texts alongside Arabic navigational knowledge. Portolan charts, used for practical sailing, were copied, annotated, and adjusted over generations. Each version preserved both insight and error. Once an error appeared in multiple trusted sources, it gained legitimacy through repetition. Familiarity reinforced belief, and correction required not only new information, but the courage to challenge what was already accepted. This conservatism explains why some inaccuracies survived for centuries. It was often safer to copy a known shape than to introduce an unfamiliar correction. A wrong coastline could still guide a ship if everyone expected it to be there, while an unfamiliar one introduced uncertainty. In this way, maps privileged continuity over innovation, stability over disruption. Another important figure in this shared tradition is Muhammad al-Idrisi, whose work drew from Greek, Islamic, and regional knowledge systems. His maps and geographic descriptions were built through extensive interviews and collected reports rather than direct exploration. Travelers were questioned systematically, conflicting accounts were compared, and consensus mattered more than novelty. The result was a world shaped by collective confidence rather than individual claim. That confidence, however, was unevenly distributed. Regions connected to major trade networks were described in greater detail, while areas outside those networks appeared distorted or vague. This was not because they were less real, but because fewer stories returned from them. Knowledge followed movement. Coastlines stabilized before interiors, rivers before mountains, harbors before hinterlands. The world entered maps in the order it was used, and maps quietly preserved the priorities of their time. Another subtle but important aspect of early cartography is translation. Knowledge rarely moved intact. Directions shifted between languages, measurements changed between systems, and place names were altered to fit pronunciation or political preference. Over time, these small changes accumulated. The same place might appear under different names, orientations, or scales across maps. Sometimes mapmakers preserved these differences. Other times they chose one version and erased the rest. Choice shaped memory. Mapmakers also worked under strict constraints. Materials were limited, and space on parchment was precious. Decisions about inclusion were practical as well as conceptual. What could not fit was often omitted, not because it was unknown, but because it was inconvenient. This reinforces a crucial idea. Absence on a map does not always signal ignorance. It often signals prioritization. Maps were further shaped by patronage. Rulers requested borders, merchants requested ports, and military leaders requested terrain. The same mapmaker could produce very different maps depending on who commissioned the work. This flexibility challenges the idea of a single, objective cartographic truth and reminds us that maps were responses to needs, not neutral records. Rarely did mapmakers begin with blank surfaces. Most worked over existing maps, tracing, correcting, and adapting them. Layers of information accumulated over time, sometimes leaving earlier outlines visible beneath newer editions. Maps were palimpsest documents where multiple moments of knowledge coexisted. This layering explains why some maps feel temporally confused, mixing recent observation with centuries-old speculation. Early mapmakers often made uncertainty visible. Notes, symbols, and blank areas signaled where confidence ended. This openness invited caution rather than certainty. Maps were consulted, not obeyed, and users supplemented them with observation and local knowledge. Only later, as maps became standardized, did trust harden and skepticism fade. The map's voice grew louder. In the period we are examining, however, shared knowledge remained visible. The seams showed. The world on paper was clearly assembled, not discovered whole. Early maps feel alive with human presence because they carry traces of voices, roots, and negotiations. They are not smooth representations, but textured records of how information moved. Seen this way, early maps stop looking like failed attempts at accuracy and begin to read as records of movement. They capture how information traveled, where it slowed, and where it gathered strength. Precision exists here, but it is uneven formed through repetition, trust, and shared use rather than direct measurement. As we move forward, these assembled worlds will come into sharper focus. Individual mapmakers will appear not as isolated creators, but as careful arrangers of inherited knowledge, blending observation with assumption. Some of what they included would later be corrected, some quietly discarded, and some would persist far longer than expected, shaping how the world was imagined long after the ink had dried. As shared information accumulated across generations, maps slowly began to do something subtle but powerful. They stopped merely recording what was reported and started extending what was assumed. When knowledge reached its edge, Mapmakers often chose continuation over silence, not out of imagination, but out of logic. The known world suggested how the unknown might look, and that suggestion was often enough to earn a place on the page. This tendency came from pattern recognition rather than fantasy. Coastlines that curved in one direction were expected to continue smoothly. Land masses that appeared substantial in one hemisphere suggested balance elsewhere. Early cartographers lived in a world where symmetry felt natural, even reassuring. A world that looked balanced on paper felt more understandable than one filled with abrupt endings. In this way, speculation entered maps quietly. It was rarely labeled as invention. Instead, it appeared as soft continuation, lightly drawn extensions, or cautiously named regions. These additions were not claims of certainty. They were visual placeholders for what had not yet been confirmed, but felt consistent with existing knowledge. Once a speculative feature appeared, even faintly, it changed how the map was read. The eye moved across it, as if it were already part of the world. Readers did not always distinguish between what was reported and what was inferred. Over time, the distinction mattered less than familiarity. Familiarity is one of the strongest forces in cartography. A feature seen repeatedly begins to feel inevitable. When copied from one map to another, speculative land gained weight not through evidence, but through repetition. Each new appearance reinforced the last, until removal felt more disruptive than retention. This is why mapmakers were often hesitant to erase features once included. Removing something suggested loss of knowledge, while keeping it preserved possibility. Absence could imply ignorance, but presence, even uncertain presence, signaled openness. Maps therefore tended to accumulate rather than simplify. Accumulation produced density. As maps filled with coastlines, notes, symbols, and annotations, they began to feel complete even when they were not. Completeness is not a function of accuracy. It is a function of coverage. A crowded map reassures the reader that little has been left unconsidered. Different mapping traditions handled this accumulation in different ways. Mediterranean cartography emphasized coastlines and navigable waters, reflecting a world connected by sea. Islamic geographic traditions often focused on routes, climates, and regions rather than precise shapes. East Asian maps frequently prioritized relational distance and administrative order over proportional scale. Each approach carried its own logic. When different mapping traditions intersected through trade, translation, and diplomacy, maps became layered objects. Accurate observations could sit beside inherited assumptions, producing representations that combined recent travel with centuries-old inference. To modern eyes, this may appear inconsistent, but for contemporaries, it felt comprehensive. A map's value lay not in internal purity, but in its ability to gather many forms of knowledge at once. Comprehensiveness mattered more than precision. Early maps were expected to serve sailors, rulers, merchants, and scholars simultaneously, each reading different layers of meaning from the same image. As shared frameworks stabilized, certain ideas, continental divisions, climate zones, expected land distributions, became embedded. New information was usually fitted into these structures rather than replacing them, allowing the overall frame to endure while details shifted slowly. The spread of printing strengthened this effect. Reproducibility favored clarity and consistency, gradually removing notes, alternatives, and visible uncertainty. Maps became cleaner and more authoritative, not because they were more accurate, but because they were uniform. As maps began to look finished, curiosity softened. The unknown felt contained, even when it remained unexplored, absorbed quietly into expectation. Over time, this stability was reinforced by habit and institutions. Maps taught in schools or used by authorities became difficult to displace, even when contradicted by new evidence. Some disproven features lingered not as stubborn errors, but as familiar companions. In this way, Old maps reveal priorities more clearly than terrain, showing how humans once organized incomplete knowledge into a world that felt whole. There was a time when the world felt unfinished, and maps reflected that feeling openly. Coastlines faded into uncertainty, oceans stretched beyond knowledge, and large areas of the page were given shape not by observation, but by expectation. These shapes were not drawn to deceive. They were drawn because leaving nothing at all felt incomplete. One of the most important facts about early cartography is that absence was uncomfortable. A blank edge suggested not just ignorance, but vulnerability. Mapmakers lived in cultures that valued coherence, balance, and order. An unshaped world felt unstable, both intellectually and emotionally. Giving form to the unknown helped restore a sense of structure. This is why many early maps include lands that were never visited, never measured, and never fully believed in. These places did not begin as myths. They began as reasonable extensions of what was already known. When knowledge stopped, logic continued. A coastline that curved steadily southward invited continuation. An island chain suggested a larger landmass beyond. Climatic symmetry implied geographic symmetry. These ideas were not arbitrary. They emerged from patterns observed elsewhere on the map. The unknown was shaped using the same rules that governed the known. One of the most persistent examples of this logic is the idea of a vast southern landmass. For centuries, many maps showed a large continent in the southern hemisphere, not because it had been seen, but because balance demanded it. If the northern hemisphere held so much land, it seemed intuitive that the south should as well. A lopsided world felt implausible. This southern land did not have a single fixed shape. On some maps, it hugged the bottom edge of the world. On others, it curved upward, nearly touching known continents. Its outline shifted from one map to another, reflecting uncertainty rather than certainty. Yet its presence remained remarkably consistent. Consistency matters. Once an idea appears repeatedly, it gains legitimacy through familiarity. Map readers begin to expect it. Mapmakers begin to include it without hesitation. Over time, the question shifts from, does this land exist? To, how should it be drawn this time? This process explains why speculative lands often survived longer than they should have. They were not preserved because evidence supported them, but because habit did. Removing them would have required reimagining the entire composition of the map. Keeping them was easier. Another category of strange lands appears in the form of exaggerated islands. Small islands were sometimes drawn far larger than their actual size. In some cases, a single island expanded into a cluster, and then into a continuous coastline. This was not carelessness. It was amplification. Amplification occurred when reports accumulated unevenly. If many sailors mentioned the same island, its importance grew in proportion to its repetition, not its physical size. An island that served as a frequent landmark could dominate the map visually, even if it was modest in reality. In other cases, islands functioned as anchors for the imagination. They marked progress across unknown waters. Each island reduced the psychological distance between known points. Stretching them, connecting them, or multiplying them made the ocean feel more navigable. This reveals a subtle fact. Maps were as much about reassurance as they were about information. They calmed uncertainty by filling space with form. Some strange lands emerged not from imagination, but from misinterpretation. Coastlines glimpsed briefly or under difficult conditions could be read incorrectly. Fog, storms, and unusual light distorted perception, turning peninsulas into islands or island chains into continuous shores. Once these shapes were drawn, they gained momentum through copying and repetition, becoming harder to question, especially when no one returned to examine them again. Language played a quiet but powerful role in this process. Descriptions passed between cultures and languages often lost precision. A word meaning coast could become continent, or a seasonal land bridge could be understood as permanent terrain. Once a place was named, it gained identity, and that identity encouraged inclusion. Some lands existed primarily as names, their forms shifting while their labels endured. Maps adjusted shape to fit memory rather than observation. Strange lands also appeared closer to home. Inland seas, misplaced rivers, and exaggerated mountain ranges showed up repeatedly, even within well-traveled regions. These features often came from second-hand accounts that emphasized experience over measurement. A river described as long might stretch unrealistically across a map, while a mountain range labeled impassable could dominate an entire region. Subjective experience quietly became scale. Many of these features were never meant to be permanent. They were provisional solutions to incomplete knowledge, but once integrated into authoritative maps, they resisted removal. Notes signaling uncertainty faded with copying, leaving confident shapes behind. These lands helped keep the world open and expansive, encouraging exploration rather than closure. When they finally disappeared, it happened slowly, leaving behind traces that revealed not geography, but how humans once shaped the unknown into something they could live with. As exploration slowly expanded, some strange lands did not disappear immediately. Instead, they changed form. A vast continent might shrink into a long peninsula. A continuous coastline might fragment into islands. This gradual transformation reflected uncertainty rather than correction. Mapmakers adjusted shapes cautiously, reducing confidence without fully withdrawing belief. Changes on old maps rarely happened all at once. Knowledge advanced unevenly, and maps recorded that imbalance faithfully. One coastline might be corrected after repeated voyages, while a neighboring region remained frozen in older assumptions. As a result, many maps became visual patchworks, combining recent observation with inherited belief. The same sheet of paper could hold different centuries of knowledge at once, each progressing at its own pace. This unevenness can be seen clearly in the long life of Terra Australis. As parts of the southern oceans were explored, the great southern continent did not vanish immediately. Instead, it retreated. Its coastline bent away from known waters, broke into fragments, or slid further south. The idea remained present even as its physical certainty weakened. The map adjusted without fully letting go. Other speculative lands survived by changing function rather than form. When they could no longer be defended as physical geography, they became conceptual spaces. Some regions shifted from solid land into vague southern expanses, climatic zones, or markers of distance. The map preserved the idea of the land even as its material reality dissolved. What mattered was not proof, but usefulness within the overall structure. This adaptability made such features remarkably resilient. They were no longer tied to a single claim that could be disproven. As long as a landmass helped balance the map visually, organize direction, or suggest continuity, it remained valuable. In this sense, utility often outweighed verification. A useful assumption could survive longer than an inconvenient correction. Another reason these lands endured lies in how difficult it was to disprove them. Absence of evidence rarely counted as evidence of absence. Oceans were vast, travel slow, and exploration expensive. A land not encountered could still exist beyond known routes. The world provided many places where uncertainty could hide without being challenged. Because of this, mapmakers seldom declared a land non-existent. Instead, they softened it. Shapes became lighter, outlines less confident, names more ambiguous. Some lands were pushed further away, as if distance itself might explain their elusiveness. The unknown did not disappear. It simply moved outward. This outward drift shaped exploration directly. Voyages were often planned around what maps suggested might exist. Ships sailed toward drawn possibilities as much as toward confirmed destinations. In this way, Maps did not merely record exploration, they actively guided it. A line on paper could redirect years of effort at sea. There are well-documented cases of explorers setting out in search of lands they first encountered not through travel, but through maps. One of the most persistent examples is Antilia, an island that appeared on multiple medieval charts in the Atlantic Ocean. It was often drawn as large, rectangular, and confidently placed, suggesting not rumor but expectation. Sailors did not question its existence immediately. Instead, they assumed it lay just beyond their current reach. When expeditions failed to find such lands, the absence itself demanded explanation. A missing island did not automatically invalidate the map. It could be argued that the land was seasonal, hidden by mist, or displaced by currents. Others suggested that earlier maps had shifted its position incorrectly, moving it too far east or west. These explanations allowed the map to survive unchanged, absorbing failure without collapsing. Similar reasoning surrounded other large islands and coastlines once shown in the North Atlantic. These features were not erased quickly because no single voyage was decisive. Oceans were vast, routes variable, and navigation imprecise. A land not encountered could still exist slightly beyond the chosen path. Uncertainty provided shelter for persistence. As navigation improved, speculation began to narrow, but slowly. Instruments allowed latitude to be fixed with greater reliability, yet longitude remained elusive for centuries. This meant that east-west placement was especially vulnerable to error. Coastlines could be confirmed repeatedly, while their horizontal position drifted from map to map. Precision increased unevenly, leaving space for inherited shapes to linger. Repeated crossings gradually reduced ambiguity. When ships passed through the same waters again and again without encountering expected land, confidence began to erode. Some features shrank, others fragmented into smaller islands, and some retreated further into open ocean. Rarely did they disappear outright. Maps adjusted cautiously, reducing commitment rather than admitting mistake. As measurement replaced inference, the visual language of maps shifted as well. Earlier charts had openly acknowledged uncertainty through notes, decorative warnings, and symbolic markers. Over time, these signals faded. Lines became cleaner, labels fewer, and ambiguity less visible. The map's tone moved from suggestion toward statement. What was no longer explained began to feel unquestionable. This change increased authority, but also illusion. A cleaner map looked more confident than it truly was. Viewers encountered finished shapes without seeing the debate that once surrounded them. Uncertainty did not vanish. It was simply hidden beneath smooth presentation. Even after strange lands vanished from maps, their influence remained. They had shaped expectations about distance, direction, and possibility. Entire generations had imagined the world with these lands in place, planning journeys and theories around them. Their removal corrected geography, but not immediately imagination. In some cases, names outlived shapes. A vanished island might persist as a sea name, a directional reference, or a historical label. Language preserved memory after geography had moved on. The map changed, but cultural traces remained embedded. This persistence reveals that maps operate on multiple timescales at once. Physical accuracy can change relatively quickly, but conceptual frameworks endure. The world on paper evolves more slowly than the world itself, carrying forward assumptions long after evidence has shifted. By the time many speculative lands were finally removed, a new expectation had already formed. Maps were now expected to show everything worth knowing. Empty space became suspicious. Silence felt like failure rather than honesty. This expectation still shapes modern mapping, where absence is often concealed rather than acknowledged. What these vanished places ultimately reveal is not deception, but process. They show how humans respond to incomplete knowledge, not by stopping, but by shaping possibility into form. Strange lands were ways of giving the unknown edges, making it navigable not only by ship, but by thought. The lands themselves may be gone, but the habit of filling the unknown remains. When people look at a map, they rarely question why it looks the way it does. Direction feels natural. Orientation feels obvious. Up is simply up. Down is simply down. Yet one of the most overlooked facts in cartography is that none of these choices are inherent. They are decisions, quiet, powerful decisions that shape how the world is perceived long before it is understood. For much of history, maps did not agree on which direction belonged at the top. North was not privileged by nature. In many early maps, east occupied the upper edge, not because it was more accurate, but because it was more meaningful. The rising sun carried spiritual weight. Beginnings came from the east. Orientation reflected belief rather than geometry. This immediately reveals an important distinction. Some maps were created to help people move through space. Others were created to help people understand their place within it. These two purposes often overlapped, but they were never identical. Maps designed for navigation, especially maritime charts, prioritized coastlines, winds, and routes. Their orientation followed practical needs. What mattered was not symbolic center, but survivability. Direction was functional. Precision mattered where danger existed. But many other maps had no interest in guiding travel. They were meant to explain importance. In these maps, orientation became a tool of emphasis rather than movement. What appeared at the top felt elevated. What appeared at the center felt essential. Distance mattered less than meaning. This is why some medieval maps placed holy cities at the center of the world, regardless of geographic accuracy. The map did not ask where the city was. It asked what the city represented. Orientation was moral, not spatial. Centering is one of the strongest signals a map can send. Whatever occupies the center becomes the reference point for everything else. Distance is measured outward. Importance radiates from it. Even without labels, the eye understands hierarchy. This is not accidental. Maps teach importance through position. As cartography developed alongside state power, orientation and centering began to serve political purposes as well. Capitals grew larger. Borders sharpened. Peripheral regions shrank visually, even if they were vast in reality. The map reinforced authority, not by words, but by layout. Some maps made their intentions explicit by emphasizing boundaries, colors, and divisions, especially in political or administrative contexts. Others achieved the same effect more subtly, through scale, placement, and visual balance. In both cases, the message was similar. The world could be ordered, organized, and made legible through drawing. The map did not merely reflect order. It suggested that order already existed. This is where different kinds of maps quietly diverge. A physical map focuses on terrain as it exists, showing mountains, rivers, and coastlines. A political map instead emphasizes control, borders, and authority as they are claimed. A thematic map shifts attention again, revealing patterns that cannot be seen directly, such as trade flows, climate zones, or population density. Each of these maps tells a different truth, and each relies on orientation to communicate that truth clearly. Orientation, therefore, is never neutral. It determines what the map emphasizes and what story it tells. The dominance of north-up orientation did not appear suddenly. It developed gradually, reinforced by navigation tools such as the magnetic compass. As European navigation expanded, north became standardized. What began as a practical convenience slowly hardened into convention. Once standardized, orientation began to feel natural and unquestionable. North felt like the top, simply because it had always been presented that way. This is how conventions gain authority, not through argument or explanation, but through repetition. Over time, the choice disappears from awareness and becomes habit. Even today, Reversing orientation can feel unsettling. South-up maps often provoke discomfort or resistance, despite being just as valid geographically. This reaction reveals how deeply orientation shapes perception. It is not merely a reference system for direction, but a habit of thought that structures how the world feels arranged. Maps can also suggest dominance without explicitly intending to do so. Regions placed higher on the page often feel superior, while those placed lower may feel secondary or marginal. Over time, these visual cues influence how places are discussed, valued, and imagined, quietly shaping cultural and political attitudes. This effect becomes stronger when orientation is combined with scale. Some maps enlarge regions not because they are physically larger, but because they are more central to the map's purpose. Other areas are compressed or simplified because they matter less to the intended audience. Scale becomes expressive rather than literal, communicating importance rather than measurement. Expressive scaling appears frequently in maps created for governance. Administrative maps enlarge areas of control and smooth out terrain to make land appear manageable. Complexity is reduced, and what cannot be governed easily is visually softened or ignored. In this sense, some maps exist not to reveal detail, but to reduce uncertainty. Decision-making requires clarity, and maps provide that clarity even when reality is far more complex. However, this clarity can also mislead. When boundaries appear sharp on paper, they feel sharp in the mind, even though many borders were historically fluid, contested, or seasonal. The map freezes them into permanence. This freezing effect is one of the most consequential powers of cartography. A line drawn once can outlive the conditions that produced it. Over time, the map stops reflecting reality and begins defining it. Orientation supports this process by stabilizing perspective, and through perspective, stabilizing meaning. Another category of maps complicates this relationship further. Maps that are not meant to represent physical space, but relationships. These include early schematic maps, religious diagrams, and later transit maps. In such cases, physical distance is sacrificed for clarity of connection, allowing relationships to be understood at a glance. A subway map, for example, does not show how far stations are from one another in real space. Instead, it shows how they connect. Orientation is chosen for readability rather than geography, yet users quickly internalize this abstract representation as real. The symbolic space becomes familiar and trusted. This reveals a deeper truth about perception. The human mind adapts easily to symbolic space, and once that space is learned, it begins to feel natural. This adaptability allows maps to guide behavior with little resistance. When a map simplifies reality, users rarely object. Complexity feels heavy, while simplicity feels reassuring. Reassurance builds trust, and trust allows maps to influence decisions far beyond navigation. Urban planning, resource allocation, military strategy, and even cultural identity are shaped by mapped perspectives. In this way, the map becomes a quiet participant in power, sometimes openly, sometimes hidden behind an appearance of neutrality. The most effective maps rarely announce their intentions. They simply present an arrangement that feels reasonable, and reasonableness is deeply persuasive. Over time, this persuasion grows stronger as maps shift from being consulted to being followed. Early maps acted as companions, while modern maps function more like instructions, a subtle but profound change. As instruction replaces consultation, choice begins to narrow. When a map suggests the best route, alternatives slowly disappear from consideration. When certain areas are highlighted, others fade into invisibility. Orientation focuses attention not through intention or malice, but through structure. Because maps cannot show everything equally, every emphasis carries consequence. Those consequences accumulate. Orientation and emphasis can reinforce long-standing inequalities, turning visual periphery into political or cultural periphery. Areas shown as empty may be treated as empty, even when they are not. Thematic maps intensify this effect by highlighting one variable while obscuring others. A map may clarify reality, but it always does so selectively, and recognizing that selectivity does not weaken maps, it makes them honest. Once orientation becomes familiar, it slowly fades from conscious awareness. People stop noticing direction as a decision and begin to experience it as fact. A map no longer feels arranged by someone. It feels as though it has simply revealed how the world already is. This transition is subtle, almost invisible, yet it marks a critical shift. Orientation stops being a choice and begins functioning as authority. Authority, in this context, does not require force or enforcement. It works best when it feels natural and unquestioned. A map that looks obvious rarely invites scrutiny. When north is always up, when the center never moves, and when scale remains consistent across generations, the world begins to feel fixed and settled. What was once a perspective gradually takes on the weight of reality itself. This is how power enters quietly, not through instruction or command, but through normalization. Maps teach by repetition, and repetition builds familiarity. Each time the same orientation appears, it reinforces a particular way of seeing. Over years and decades, that way of seeing becomes the default lens through which the world is interpreted. Different kinds of maps participate in this process in different ways. Maps designed for navigation emphasize direction, distance, and continuity because survival depends on those elements. Maps designed for administration emphasize clarity, division, and boundaries because governance depends on order. Maps designed for explanation emphasize patterns, relationships, and trends because understanding depends on comparison. Each type relies on orientation to serve its purpose, and none of them operate without influence. Some maps prioritize movement above all else. They are concerned with routes, transitions, and connections, guiding the eye along paths rather than across territories. Others prioritize control. These maps focus on edges, ownership, and separation, making boundaries feel solid and unquestionable. Still others prioritize understanding, highlighting invisible systems such as climate flows, trade networks, or population patterns. Orientation shifts subtly in each case to support what the map is trying to do. A map designed for movement often centers the traveler. Direction flows outward from the user's position, making the individual the reference point. A map designed for authority centers institutions. Instead, capitals, borders, and administrative regions become visual anchors. A map designed for explanation may center variables rather than places, allowing data to become the landscape itself. Each choice changes what feels important. These differences matter because orientation directs attention. What appears at the center of a map feels primary, stable, and significant, while what drifts toward the edges feels distant or secondary. Over time, these visual cues influence how regions are discussed, funded, defended, or ignored. The map rarely needs to state what matters. It communicates importance through placement alone. Historically, this effect helps stabilize power. Empires often placed themselves at the center of their world maps, not always as deliberate propaganda, but as a quiet assumption. The world was drawn outward from authority, making distance synonymous with difference. Even when unintended, this centering produced hierarchy, gradually training the eye to focus on some regions while overlooking others. The effect grows stronger when orientation is combined with scale and simplification. Areas of interest are enlarged, while less valued regions are compressed. Administrative and political maps rely heavily on this approach, reducing complex terrain into manageable zones and clear divisions. Clarity encourages action, but it also freezes fluid realities, turning temporary arrangements into structures that feel permanent. As maps evolved, this logic extended beyond physical space. Thematic and digital maps reorganized the world around patterns, data, and relationships, shaping decisions without issuing instructions. Orientation shifted from symbol to convention, and then to personalization, guiding attention before conscious thought could intervene. By the time lines and borders appear, the mind has already prepared direction, has framed the world, making division feel natural. As maps expanded into unknown regions, they faced a problem that measurement alone could not solve. There were places where coastlines ended, routes dissolved, and reports contradicted one another. In these spaces, the map could no longer rely on observation. Something else was needed to communicate uncertainty without leaving silence behind. Silence on a map was never neutral. A blank area suggested absence, but also neglect. It raised questions the map was not ready to answer. Early mapmakers understood this instinctively. When knowledge stopped, they did not always leave emptiness. Instead, they filled uncertainty with symbols. These symbols were not decoration in the modern sense. They functioned as a language, one that translated incomplete knowledge into visual form. Sea monsters, strange creatures, exaggerated waves, swirling winds, and unfamiliar scripts all served a similar purpose. They marked the limits of what was known without pretending to extend it. One of the most misunderstood facts about old maps is the role of these figures. They were not meant to frighten casual viewers or tell mythological stories. In many cases, they were practical warnings. A creature placed in open water often signaled dangerous currents, unpredictable weather, or areas where ships frequently vanished. These warnings followed patterns. Certain regions of the ocean consistently attracted similar imagery across different maps and cultures. This repetition suggests that symbols were responding to shared experience rather than imagination. When multiple sailors reported difficulty in the same waters, the map responded with caution, not measurement. Some symbols appeared where navigation was unreliable rather than impossible. Shallow waters, shifting sands, or magnetic irregularities were difficult to chart precisely. Instead of forcing false accuracy, mapmakers used imagery to communicate risk. The symbols stood in for data that could not yet be fixed. This approach reveals a quiet honesty. Rather than pretending to know more than they did, mapmakers acknowledged uncertainty visually. The symbol said, in effect, something happens here, but we cannot describe it precisely. It was an admission, not a claim. Written warnings played a role similar to visual symbols, but they were used with restraint. Explicit phrases indicating danger or unfamiliarity appeared only in specific places, never spread casually across the map. Contrary to popular belief, statements like, "Here be dragons," were rare rather than common. When such warnings did appear, they were placed deliberately in regions where information was especially thin, conflicting, or unreliable. More often, caution was communicated indirectly. Instead of words, mapmakers increased visual density. Decorations multiplied, seas became more animated, and margins filled with movement. Calm, orderly coastlines gradually gave way to restless waters filled with waves, creatures, or swirling forms. The viewer did not need explanation. The eye recognized instability instinctively. Empty space also functioned as a meaningful signal. Some regions were left intentionally blank, even when the mapmaker could have filled them with speculation or borrowed detail. This absence was not an oversight. It marked areas beyond the current reach of shared knowledge, places that had not yet been integrated into the known world. Leaving an area blank was not the same as ignoring it. It was a pause made visible. The lack of detail communicated restraint and respect for uncertainty. In this way, emptiness carried information of its own, functioning as quietly as any symbol or figure. Symbols and blankness often worked together. One dramatized uncertainty, while the other preserved it. Together, they prevented the map from creating a false sense of completeness. They reminded the viewer that the world extended beyond the edges of what had been drawn. Although the visual language varied between cultures, the underlying logic remained remarkably consistent. Different traditions employed different imagery, scripts, and styles, yet they tended to place these markers in similar locations. The unknown clustered near the edges of maps, far from centers of authority and well-traveled routes. Edges mattered deeply in cartography. On a map, the edge was where control weakened and certainty thinned. Knowledge became fragile there. Measurements gave way to stories, and symbols gathered not because of imagination, but because of distance from reliable information. Distance introduced delay. Reports arrived slowly, fragmented, and often outdated by the time they were compiled. Conditions could change between voyages, and accounts frequently contradicted one another. The map needed a way to hold uncertainty without resolving it prematurely. Symbols provided that flexibility. They could remain in place even as new information emerged. They did not demand constant correction or precise updating. Instead, they marked regions as unstable in knowledge terms, allowing the map to remain useful without pretending to finality. This is why symbolic warnings persisted even as navigation improved. Better instruments reduced certain uncertainties, but they could not eliminate all risk. Oceans remained unpredictable, weather difficult to anticipate, and currents hard to model. Where data could not yet replace experience, symbols continued to stand in. Some symbols also served a psychological function. They prepared the viewer for difficulty before any journey began. The map did more than guide movement. It shaped expectation. A sailor approaching a symbol-marked region anticipated danger long before encountering it. Expectation influenced behavior. Routes were adjusted, supplies reconsidered, and preparations intensified. Decisions were shaped in advance. In this way, the map extended its influence beyond representation and into planning itself. Importantly, these symbols did not claim literal truth. They suggested possibility rather than certainty. A creature did not assert its own existence. It implied risk. This ambiguity allowed the map to remain credible even if the symbol was never directly encountered. As shared knowledge expanded, some symbols faded while others shifted or changed meaning. Dangers once thought universal became localized, and warnings tied to myth were gradually reinterpreted as weather patterns, currents, or navigational difficulty. The map evolved layer by layer, adjusting to new understanding without fully erasing its past, allowing older meanings to coexist quietly with newer explanations. At the same time, certain symbols endured far longer than expected. Through repetition and copying, practical warnings slowly became part of visual tradition. Printers and engravers preserved familiar imagery, even as its original intent softened. Over time, these symbols were read less as information and more as decoration or myth, though their placement often at the edges continued to signal uncertainty. This balance between warning and openness was one of early cartography's most subtle achievements. Symbols allowed maps to acknowledge limits without closing them, preserving ambiguity where borders could not yet be drawn. As mapping grew more precise, this symbolic language became quieter, replaced by abstraction and omission rather than figures. Yet its function remains. Maps still communicate what they cannot fully explain, reminding us that uncertainty is not failure, but a stage that simply changes form. As symbolic language matured, maps began to rely less on figures and more on restraint. The absence of imagery became as meaningful as its presence. Where monsters once swam and winds once twisted the margins, some later maps offered little more than pale outlines or lightly shaded space. This was not confidence. It was a quieter way of admitting uncertainty. Silence on a map does not mean nothing is being said. It often means something cannot yet be said clearly. In many historical cases, areas that appear empty were well known to exist, but poorly understood in detail. Rather than inventing form, map makers chose to withhold it. This restraint preserved credibility. Withholding information is a decision, not a failure. It requires judgment about when to stop drawing. As mapping techniques improved, the temptation to fill space grew stronger. Yet many cartographers resisted this impulse, understanding that false clarity could be more misleading than honest omission. This approach created a new kind of warning. Instead of dramatic symbols, the map communicated risk through understatement. Sparse labeling, faded outlines, and reduced detail signaled areas that resisted easy description. The viewer learned to read quietness as caution. Over time, readers adapted to this language. What once required monsters now required experience. Seasoned navigators learned to interpret density, spacing, and absence. The map became a subtle conversation between maker and user. This shift coincided with changes in how knowledge itself was valued. As scientific thinking gained influence, overt symbolism began to feel excessive. Precision was admired, and speculation was increasingly hidden. But uncertainty did not disappear. It was simply folded into structure. This folding had consequences. When uncertainty becomes invisible, it can be mistaken for absence. A blank space might be read as empty rather than unknown. This misreading alters behavior. People treat silence differently than warning. In earlier maps, danger announced itself loudly. In later maps, danger often appeared calm. This calmness could be deceptive. Smooth lines and even shading suggested stability where none existed. The map looked finished, even when knowledge was not. This growing visual confidence began to influence decision-making in concrete ways. Routes were planned, territories discussed, and resources allocated based on maps that no longer openly acknowledged doubt. The absence of visible warning was often mistaken for safety. In reality, uncertainty had not disappeared. It had simply changed form. At the same time, the gradual removal of symbols transformed the emotional relationship between viewer and map. Fear and caution slowly gave way to trust. The map no longer invited interpretation or hesitation. It invited compliance. As ambiguity retreated from view, authority quietly increased. This shift did not mean that symbols vanished completely. They survived in specific contexts such as nautical charts, hazard maps, and later, technical and engineering diagrams. However, in general representations of the world, they became increasingly rare. The dominant visual language favored cleanliness, balance, and neutrality. Neutrality, however, should not be confused with objectivity. A map that appears neutral can still guide behavior powerfully. When uncertainty is hidden rather than marked, the map's suggestions feel more definitive. The viewer is encouraged to assume completeness, even when it does not exist. Completeness is persuasive. A map that appears whole discourages questioning and invites reliance. Over time, reliance becomes habit, and habit turns into trust. The map's authority grows not only through accuracy, but through repeated use without visible challenge. When experience conflicts with the map is often trusted more than observation. As this trust deepened, maps gradually shifted from following exploration to leading it. The symbolic language that once acknowledged uncertainty faded, replaced by smooth visuals that assumed resolution. The unknown was no longer marked as dangerous or mysterious. It was simply left out. What is not shown fades from attention, and what is not named becomes difficult to question. Silence began to direct more effectively than warning ever had. This quiet exclusion created a paradox. Maps became more precise, yet their limits grew less visible. Uncertainty did not disappear, it became harder to see. Symbolic warnings vanished not because they were wrong, but because they revealed doubt too openly. In their place emerged systems of selection layers, filters, and defaults, where the unknown no longer lived at the edges of maps, but inside them, unseen. Modern maps did not arrive suddenly. They emerged gradually from a long process of refinement, correction, and replacement. What changed was not only the accuracy of maps, but their relationship with uncertainty. Where older maps openly showed their limits, modern maps began to hide them behind precision. Modern maps did not arrive suddenly. They emerged gradually from a long process of refinement, correction, and replacement. What changed was not only the accuracy of maps, but their relationship with uncertainty. Where older maps openly showed their limits, modern maps began to hide them behind precision. This sense of completeness creates a powerful impression of trust. A map that looks finished suggests that nothing important has been left out. The absence of blank space implies certainty, even when certainty does not truly exist. Viewers rarely pause to consider what might be missing, because modern maps no longer signal uncertainty openly. Yet modern maps are not neutral reflections of reality. They are constructed systems shaped by countless decisions. Every map involves choices about what to include, what to simplify, what to emphasize, and what to ignore. These decisions are rarely visible, but they influence perception just as strongly as the monsters and symbols of older maps once did. One of the most important facts about modern mapping is that not everything measured is shown. Enormous volumes of data are collected, but only a fraction is displayed. The map is not the territory. It is a filtered interpretation of it. What remains unseen is often as important as what appears. This filtering happens quietly. Layers of information exist beneath the surface, but the user encounters only what is considered relevant. Roads appear before footpaths, cities before villages, and certain names at one zoom level disappear entirely at another. The map guides attention without announcing that it is doing so. Zooming itself has changed how maps communicate meaning. As the viewer moves closer, detail emerges. As they pull back, detail vanishes. This creates a sense of control, but it also reinforces hierarchy. What remains visible from a distance feels important, while what requires closeness to appear feels secondary. This hierarchy is not accidental. It reflects priorities built into the system. Decisions about visibility are often shaped by usage patterns, economic relevance, and infrastructure, rather than by existence alone. The map adapts to what is used most, not to what exists most. Another significant shift is the disappearance of explicit warning. Modern maps rarely show danger directly. There are no sea monsters, no written cautions, no symbolic margins. Risk is managed differently now, through omission rather than confrontation. Instead of warning about a place, the map may simply fail to highlight it. A route may be omitted, a location may appear ordinary, and a region may seem empty. This does not necessarily mean the area is safe or unimportant, but that it falls outside the map's priorities. This is one of the quietest transformations in cartographic history. The unknown is no longer marked as unknown. It is absorbed into the background. What cannot be confidently represented is often left unrepresented. In older maps, uncertainty was visible. In modern maps, uncertainty is invisible. This invisibility changes behavior. When danger is not signaled, caution decreases. Smooth visuals and balanced design encourage trust, leading users to assume that what they see is sufficient to act upon. Modern maps also respond to behavior. Routes are suggested based on traffic patterns. Places are ranked according to popularity, and visibility is influenced by collective movement. The map learns from use and adjusts itself continuously. This creates a feedback loop. The map does not merely reflect how people move. It begins to shape how they move. What is suggested becomes what is chosen, and what is chosen becomes more visible. Over time, popular routes grow more prominent, while less used paths fade into obscurity. Another important fact is that modern maps personalize perspective. Two people looking at the same area may not see the same map. Search history, location, and behavior can influence what appears first. The experience feels tailored, even intimate. Personalization feels helpful, but it is also exclusionary. What is not relevant to the individual may never appear at all. In this way, modern maps no longer present a single shared world. They present individualized versions of it. This represents a profound shift from earlier mapping traditions. Old maps were collective objects. Everyone saw the same warnings, the same uncertainties, and the same gaps. Modern maps fragment that shared experience into many parallel realities. Another subtle change appears in naming. Modern maps update names quickly, sometimes faster than social or cultural agreement. A name that appears on a map gains legitimacy, even if it is contested or temporary. Conversely, names that disappear fade from recognition. This power of naming has always existed, but modern systems amplify it dramatically. Changes propagate instantly and globally. A decision made in a database can alter how millions perceive a place almost overnight. Modern maps also compress time. Conditions change and updates arrive rapidly, creating the impression that the map is always current. Yet not all layers update at the same speed. Some information lags behind reality, even as the map looks confident. This uneven updating creates new forms of uncertainty. A road may appear open but be closed. A boundary may appear fixed but be disputed. Because uncertainty is hidden, users rarely question the map's limits. Errors are often blamed on glitches rather than on structural choices. Trust grows from this confidence. Trust encourages reliance, and reliance reduces independent judgment. Over time, navigation becomes less about reading space and more about following instruction. The map shifts from reference to guide. This influence extends far beyond travel. Maps shape where people gather, where businesses flourish, and which areas feel central or peripheral. Visibility becomes relevance. What is highlighted attracts attention, investment, and movement, while what is not highlighted slowly fades. Less attention leads to less activity, and reduced activity then justifies continued invisibility, reinforcing the cycle. This process echoes older cartographic patterns, but with an important difference. Where historical maps placed uncertainty at their edges, modern maps internalize it. The unknown is no longer a boundary marked with symbols or warnings. It becomes a filter. Filtering is efficient, reducing complexity and making the world easier to navigate. But it also narrows perception by quietly deciding what matters. Modern maps do not deceive. They simply do not show everything. Their calm, aesthetic, clean lines, balanced colors, smooth transitions creates a sense of stability, even when reality is fluid. Mystery has not disappeared, but relocated into algorithms, thresholds, and defaults. To understand modern maps is not to reject them, but to read them attentively, recognizing that every omission is a choice, and that the unknown has not vanished, it has learned how to hide. As modern maps grew quieter, their influence did not disappear. Instead, it became more refined and less noticeable. Guidance shifted away from visible symbols and explicit warnings toward underlying structure. The map no longer needed to announce danger or uncertainty, because its design already shaped behavior. What felt intuitive to the user was often the result of careful selection rather than neutral presentation. One of the least noticed facts about contemporary maps is the power of defaults. The first route suggested, the places that appear without searching, and the names visible at a distance are not passive outcomes. They are the result of systems designed to reduce complexity by prioritizing certain possibilities over others. What appears first feels natural, even inevitable. Reducing complexity feels helpful. It saves time, lowers cognitive effort, and creates a sense of ease. Yet ease also narrows awareness. When fewer options are visible, fewer options are considered. The map becomes more efficient, but the world it presents quietly becomes smaller. This shrinking is rarely experienced as loss. The map still feels full and active. Streets, destinations, and paths appear everywhere, creating an impression of abundance. What disappears does so silently, without contrast. There is no blank space to signal absence, and no symbol to mark uncertainty. Another important shift lies in how modern maps treat change. They update continuously, creating the impression of constant accuracy and immediacy. Yet not all change is equally visible. Physical changes may appear quickly, while social, cultural, or experiential changes often lag behind or remain unrepresented. This imbalance alters understanding. The map reflects movement, but not meaning. It shows where people go, but not why they go there. It captures patterns of behavior, but not lived experience. What cannot be easily measured tends to fade from view. Over time, this shapes how places are perceived. Areas rich in activity appear important and central. Areas rich in memory, culture, or meaning, but low in measurable interaction, appear quiet or empty. The map reinforces this distinction without ever stating it directly. In this way, modern maps inherit an old role in a new form. They still define centers and margins. They still guide attention and influence behavior. The difference lies in how openly they acknowledge their limits. Older maps admitted uncertainty through imagery, symbols, and deliberate blankness. Modern maps absorb uncertainty into systems. What cannot be resolved is filtered rather than framed. The unknown is managed quietly, not marked visibly. This management feels neutral precisely because it is calm. There is no drama, no warning, no visual disruption. The map appears stable, balanced, and complete. Its authority comes from smoothness rather than spectacle. Smoothness encourages trust. Trust encourages reliance. Reliance reduces the impulse to question. Over time, the map becomes a background presence consulted, automatically rather than consciously interpreted. Yet the world itself remains complex. No system can capture it fully. No map can represent every relationship, every risk, or every story embedded in a place. What changes is not the world, but how its limits are acknowledged. Understanding this does not require suspicion or rejection of modern maps. They are powerful tools that extend human reach, improve coordination, and make vast and complex spaces navigable. Their usefulness is real and undeniable, and daily life would be difficult to imagine without them. What changes is not their value, but the way they quietly shape perception. What matters is remembering that selection is not the absence of bias, but a different expression of it. Every map simplifies reality in order to function, and every simplification carries consequence. Choices about visibility, emphasis, and omission shape understanding long before the viewer becomes consciously aware that a choice has been made. When the unknown is no longer visible, it becomes harder to notice. When it becomes harder to notice, it becomes easier to ignore. Over time, what is ignored does not disappear. It continues to influence decisions quietly, operating beneath awareness rather than announcing itself openly. This does not mean the unknown has vanished. It continues to exist in unmeasured experiences, overlooked places, and patterns that resist easy modeling or quantification. There are aspects of the world that cannot be reduced to coordinates, traffic data, or usage statistics. These elements live outside the map's visible frame, quietly shaping reality even when they cannot be easily represented. Often, these unseen layers are experiential rather than spatial. They include how a place feels at different times, how memory accumulates in certain locations, or how meaning shifts depending on who is present. Modern maps struggle to hold these qualities, not because they are insignificant, but because they do not translate well into data. What cannot be standardized tends to fade from view. The difference between old and modern maps is subtle but important. Earlier maps placed the unknown at their edges, where it could be seen, acknowledged, and even respected. The margins were spaces of uncertainty, clearly marked as such. Modern maps, by contrast, absorb the unknown into their systems, where it becomes harder to locate and easier to forget. When uncertainty is internalized in this way, it loses its visual presence. There is no boundary to signal where knowledge ends. The map appears seamless, even when understanding is not. This seamlessness encourages confidence, but it also discourages pause. This is the final continuity between old and new cartography. Tools change, aesthetics evolve, and technologies advance, but the fundamental challenge remains the same: representing a world that can never be fully known. Every map is an attempt to make the infinite manageable. Maps respond to this challenge by choosing what to show. What they leave out is not empty. It is simply quiet. And in that quiet space, the unknown waits, not as a monster or a warning, but as something easily overlooked. This is where the map ends, and where curiosity gently begins.